They didn't refuse the cigarettes out of pride. They refused them out of terror. When U.S. Marines captured the first Japanese soldiers on Guadalcanal in late 1942, they followed standard procedure: offer water, food, and a cigarette. It was not kindness. It was protocol, a way to calm prisoners, encourage cooperation, and signal that they would be treated humanely under the Geneva Convention. But the Japanese soldiers recoiled. Some spat out the water. Others buried the food in the sand. And when offered a cigarette, Lucky Strike, Camel, or Chesterfield, they either threw it away or stared at it like it was a live grenade. One young private, captured near Henderson Field, began to weep when a Marine lit one for him. Not from gratitude, from dread. Later, through an interpreter, he explained, "You were trying to poison us. It is what we were told Americans do." This was not an isolated incident. From the jungles of New Guinea to the caves of Iwo Jima, Japanese soldiers consistently refused American cigarettes, convinced they were laced with slow-acting toxins, mind-control drugs, or biological agents designed to make them betray their country. And in their fear, they revealed the true horror of the Pacific War, not just the battles, but the psychological conditioning that turned survival into betrayal. To understand why a cigarette could inspire such terror, we must first understand the world Japanese soldiers inhabited. By 1942, the Imperial Japanese military had spent years indoctrinating its troops with a singular, unbreakable belief: surrender was dishonorable, and capture by Americans meant torture, mutilation, and death. This was not mere propaganda. It was doctrine. Field manuals instructed soldiers to fight to the death. Officers told recruits that Americans boiled prisoners alive, carved their flesh for trophies, and fed them to sharks. Leaflets dropped over occupied islands warned, "The American devil does not take prisoners, he takes souvenirs." And in the early years of the war, this belief was reinforced by reality. When Japanese forces captured American troops in the Philippines, they often executed them or subjected them to brutal treatment. In turn, when U.S. troops found the mutilated bodies of their comrades, ears cut off, skulls turned into letter openers, they responded with equal fury. The cycle of dehumanization was complete. But for Japanese soldiers, the fear went deeper. Because in their culture, honor was not just a value, it was identity. To surrender was to erase your name, shame your family, and condemn your ancestors. Death was not the worst outcome. Survival without honor was. So when Americans offered cigarettes, a symbol of casual, almost careless abundance, it didn't feel like mercy. It felt like a test or a trick. The cigarette in particular was a potent symbol. In Japan, tobacco was rationed. By 1943, soldiers received only a few cigarettes per month, often stale, poorly rolled, and hoarded like gold. Smoking was not a habit. It was a ritual, a moment of calm in the storm. But American cigarettes, they were everywhere. Marines smoked while advancing. Sailors smoked on deck. Pilots smoked in cockpits. Cigarettes were included in K rations, handed out by medics, traded like currency. To Japanese eyes, this abundance was unnatural, suspicious, decadent. How could a nation so wasteful with something so precious be trusted? And worse, why would they give it to the enemy? The logic was inescapable. If Americans valued life so little, they must value death even more. So the cigarettes must be poisoned. Not with cyanide or arsenic. Those would be too quick, too merciful. But with something slower, something insidious. A drug that would make a man talk in his sleep. A toxin that would rot his mind over weeks. A biological agent that would turn him into a traitor without even knowing it. This belief was so widespread that Japanese intelligence officers included it in official briefings. A captured document from the 17th Army on Guadalcanal, dated October 1942, reads, "Beware of American kindness. Their food is drugged, their water is tainted, their cigarettes contain chemicals that weaken the will and induce madness. To accept them is to surrender your soul." It was not paranoia. It was policy. The U.S. military was baffled. Marines reported that even wounded Japanese soldiers would refuse morphine if it came from an American medic. Prisoners would rather starve than eat U.S. rations. And cigarettes? They were treated like contraband. On Tarawa in 1943, a group of 12 captured Japanese soldiers were offered cigarettes by their Marine guards. 11 refused. The 12th took one, smoked half, then vomited violently. Not from poison, but from sheer terror. He spent the next 3 days in a catatonic state, convinced he was dying. At a POW camp in Hawaii, a former Imperial Army sergeant named Kenji Sato later confessed in an interrogation. "We were told that American cigarettes contained a powder that made you forget your emperor. That you would wake up speaking English, calling yourself an American. We believed it. Because what else could explain their generosity? In our world, nothing was given freely. Everything had a price. And the price of a cigarette was your soul." This was the core of the horror. Not that the cigarettes were poisoned, but that the men believed they had to be. Because in the moral universe they inhabited, kindness without cost was impossible. And the Americans, with their endless supplies of food, medicine, and tobacco, defied that universe. So they had to be lying. But the truth was even more devastating. The cigarettes were a weapon. Not because they were poisoned, but because they were real. Every time a Marine lit a cigarette in front of a Japanese soldier, he was broadcasting a message more powerful than any bomb. We have so much, we can afford to share it even with our enemies. This was psychological warfare of the highest order. While Japanese troops starved in foxholes, eating boiled grass and drinking from mud puddles, Americans ate Spam, drank Coca-Cola, and smoked fresh cigarettes. The contrast was not just material, it was existential. It said, "Your cause is failing. Your empire is hollow. Your sacrifice is meaningless." And for men who had been told they were fighting for a divine mission, that message was more terrifying than any bullet. The U.S. eventually realized this. By 1944, psychological operations units began deliberately using cigarettes as surrender incentives. Leaflets dropped over Iwo Jima and Okinawa showed images of well-fed Japanese POWs smoking American cigarettes, playing baseball, and writing letters home. The text read, "Your comrades are safe. They eat well, they smoke Lucky Strikes, they are treated with honor. Lay down your arms, live." To American planners, it was a humane tactic. To Japanese soldiers, it was proof of the ultimate deception. Because if their captured brothers were smoking American cigarettes, then they had already been broken. And to join them would be to confirm the worst fear of all, that the war was not just lost, but unjust. Yet for some, the cigarette became a lifeline. In the caves of Iwo Jima, where thousands of Japanese soldiers were trapped with no food, no water, and no hope, the offer of a cigarette was sometimes the only thing that made them emerge. Not because they believed it was safe, but because they were tired. Tired of fear, tired of hunger, tired of dying for a cause that no longer made sense. One survivor, interviewed in 1985, described it this way. "I saw the American holding the cigarette. His hands were clean. His uniform was whole. He looked calm. In that moment, I realized he is not afraid of me, and I am so afraid of everything. So I took it. Not because I trusted him, but because I wanted to feel, just once, what it was like to not be afraid. He smoked the whole cigarette. Then, he surrendered. He lived to be 89, and every year on the anniversary of Iwo Jima, he would buy a pack of Camels, smoke one in silence, and say, "That cigarette saved my life." Not because it was clean, but because it was real.
The belief that American cigarettes were poisoned did not exist in a vacuum. It was part of a vast, meticulously constructed ecosystem of fear, one that stretched from Tokyo's propaganda ministries to the foxholes of Iwo Jima, and even into the secret laboratories of the United States itself. For while Japanese soldiers were taught to see every act of American kindness as a trap, the truth was far more unsettling. Sometimes, the trap was real. Not in the way they imagined. No cigarettes were laced with mind-control drugs for ordinary POWs, but in subtler, more insidious ways that blurred the line between myth and reality. And in that gray zone, paranoia thrived. The most chilling example came not from Tokyo, but from Washington. In late 1943, the Office of Strategic Services, the precursor to the CIA, launched a classified program codenamed Smoke Signal. Its goal was simple: to develop a cigarette that could deliver a fast-acting truth serum through inhalation, bypassing the need for injections or forced ingestion. The compound, a derivative of scopolamine mixed with a mild sedative, was designed to lower inhibitions and increase suggestibility within minutes of smoking. The target? Not rank-and-file soldiers, but high-value prisoners, intelligence officers, naval commanders, scientists working on Japan's secret weapons programs. Declassified OSS memos reveal that prototype cigarettes were tested on volunteer U.S. soldiers at Camp David in early 1944. The results were mixed. Some subjects became talkative, even confessional. Others experienced dizziness, nausea, or paranoia. One memo dryly noted, "Subject believed interrogators were demons, not useful." The program was shelved by mid-1944, not because it failed, but because the war was moving too fast. Island after island fell to American forces. Interrogators found that exhaustion, isolation, and basic human decency were more effective than chemicals. But the legend of Smoke Signal did not die. Through intercepted radio traffic, Japanese intelligence caught wind of American truth smoke experiments. They didn't know the program had been abandoned. They didn't know it was never used on Japanese POWs. All they knew was that the Americans were developing poisoned cigarettes. And in the paranoid logic of total war, that was enough. By 1945, Imperial Army field manuals included explicit warnings. Beware of enemy tobacco. It may appear normal, but it carries the breath of betrayal. Soldiers were taught to inspect every cigarette for unnatural smoothness or foreign scent, signs, they were told, of chemical tampering. This wasn't just propaganda. It was psychological armor. Because in a war where surrender meant eternal shame, the belief that American kindness was poison gave men a reason to resist, not just physically, but morally. If every cigarette was a weapon, then refusing it was an act of loyalty. If every meal was a trap, then starving was an act of purity. And if death was the only escape from corruption, then suicide was the ultimate act of honor. Nowhere was this logic more devastating than on the island of Saipan. In June 1944, as U.S. forces closed in on the last Japanese stronghold, over 3,000 civilians and soldiers gathered on the cliffs of Marpi Point. They heard the rumors. Japanese tortured prisoners. They fed them poisoned food. They made men smoke until they confessed their deepest secrets. And worst of all, they forced them to live. For many, that was the true horror. Not death, but survival. Eyewitness accounts from U.S. Marines describe a scene of unimaginable tragedy. Families embraced. Soldiers helped civilians jump. Mothers threw their children into the sea, then followed. Over 1,000 people died in a single day, not from bullets, but from the belief that life under American rule was worse than death.
Among the dead was Lieutenant Kenjiro Sato, a 28-year-old communications officer. Before jumping, he wrote a final note to his wife. Quote, "They offered us cigarettes today. I saw one man take it. His eyes changed. He smiled. That is how they break you, not with pain, but with comfort. I will not let them have my soul. Tell our son, never trust a kind enemy." His body was found clutching an unopened pack of Lucky Strikes, dropped by a Marine who tried to offer it as a peace gesture. The pack was never smoked, but the fear it represented lived on. Back in the United States, a different kind of drama was unfolding in the POW camps. At Camp Lordsburg in New Mexico, the only camp to hold Japanese POWs classified as high risk, a quiet experiment in trust was taking place. Sergeant Frank Delaney, the same Marine who had written about prisoners praying over cigarettes on Iwo Jima, was now a camp guard. He'd been wounded in the leg and reassigned to stateside duty, but he couldn't forget the look in the eyes of the men he'd captured. Fear, yes, but also something deeper. Grief. One evening in March 1945, Delaney sat outside Barracks 3, smoking a Camel. A young prisoner, Private Hiroshi Tanaka, the same man who had first accepted a cigarette at Camp McCoy, was on latrine duty nearby. He paused, watching Delaney with wary eyes. Delaney didn't speak Japanese. Tanaka barely spoke English. But Delaney did something simple. He held out a cigarette. Not as a test, not as a trick, just as a man offering another man a smoke. Tanaka hesitated. Then he took it. They sat in silence for 20 minutes, smoking under the New Mexico stars. No words, no gestures, just two soldiers, enemies by circumstance, sharing a moment of quiet humanity. Later, Tanaka would say in a post-war interview, "That cigarette did not poison me, but it did something worse. It made me see him as human. And once you see your enemy as human, you can never unsee it." That night marked a turning point in Tanaka's captivity. He began to speak during interrogations, not secrets, but stories, about his village in Kyoto, his father's school, the cherry blossoms in spring. He even asked Delaney about his family in Iowa. The camp commandant was furious. "You're softening them," he told Delaney. "We need information, not friendship." But Delaney replied, "They'll tell us more if they trust us than if they fear us." He was right. Within weeks, Tanaka helped translate for other prisoners. He calmed new arrivals who were panicking about poisoned food. He even convinced a group of die-hard officers to stop sabotaging camp operations. All because of a cigarette. Not poisoned, but powerful. Yet, for every Tanaka, there were dozens who could not be reached. At Camp Blanding in Florida, a group of 17 Japanese naval officers refused all American goods for over a year. They ate only rice and water provided by the Red Cross. They wore their tattered uniforms until they fell apart, and they never, ever accepted a cigarette. When asked why, their spokesman, Commander Isamu Kato, wrote in a letter, "You do not understand. It is not the cigarette we fear. It is what it represents. In Japan, we are taught that the body is a vessel for the spirit. To put foreign smoke in that vessel is to invite foreign thoughts, and foreign thoughts lead to foreign loyalties. We would rather die pure than live corrupted." In 1946, as repatriation neared, Kato and his men were offered American suits for the journey home. They refused. They boarded the ship in their threadbare uniforms, heads high, eyes forward. None of them ever spoke of their time in captivity. But decades later, a former camp guard found a hidden note in the barracks wall. It read, "I wanted to smoke it. just once, to know what it tasted like. But I was afraid I would like it, and then I would be lost. The note was unsigned, but the handwriting matched Kato's.
The psychological toll of this benevolence trauma, as modern therapists now call it, was immense. Unlike German POWs, who were often processed in large groups and integrated into camp life, Japanese prisoners were isolated, rare, and viewed with deep suspicion by both captors and their own countrymen. The U.S. government feared they would never surrender, so when they did, they were treated as anomalies, sometimes with extra caution, sometimes with extra cruelty. But the deepest wound was internal. Because to accept American kindness was to admit that the enemy was not a monster. And if the enemy was not a monster, then what did that make the war? What did it make them? This cognitive dissonance shattered some men completely. At Camp Ruston, a Japanese prisoner named Takeshi Mori was found in his bunk one morning dead by his own hand. In his pocket was a half-smoked Camel, the first and only cigarette he had ever accepted. On the wall, written in charcoal, were 3 words, "I am weak." He didn't die because the cigarette was poisoned. He died because he believed his desire for it was. But the most haunting legacy of the cigarette fear is not in the past, it is in the present. In 2005, during the Iraq War, a U.S. Army psychologist stationed at a detention facility in Baghdad reported a disturbing pattern. Some Iraqi detainees refused food, water, and medical care not out of protest, but because they believed American kindness was a prelude to torture. One man whispered to an interpreter, "In my country, they say Americans poison the food to make you talk." The psychologist recognized the pattern immediately. It was the same logic that had driven Japanese soldiers to suicide on Saipan. The same fear that had made Hiroshi Tanaka tremble before lighting a Camel. The same belief that mercy is a weapon. She began a new protocol. Before offering anything, she would eat the same food, drink the same water, smoke the same cigarette in front of the detainee. Not as proof, but as witness. And slowly, trust returned. Because the antidote to benevolence trauma is not force. It is shared vulnerability. Back in post-war Japan, the cigarette fear evolved into something quieter but no less profound. For decades, American brands like Lucky Strike and Camel were shunned by veterans, not out of lingering paranoia, but out of shame. Because to smoke an American cigarette was to remember the moment you chose survival over purity. The moment you admitted the enemy was a human. The moment you realized the war had been built on lies. One former soldier, interviewed in 1991, said, "I kept one American cigarette for 50 years. I never smoked it. I just looked at it. It reminded me that I was not the hero my country said I was. I was just a man who wanted to live." And that is the hardest truth of all. His son later donated the cigarette to the Hiroshima Peace Memorial Museum. It sits in a glass case today, labeled simply, "The Taste of Survival." But perhaps the most enduring symbol of this story is not in a museum. It is in a small cemetery outside Kyoto. There, in an unmarked grave, lies Private Hiroshi Tanaka. After the war, he returned to Japan, married, had children, and worked as a schoolteacher, just like his father. He never spoke of his time in America. But every year, on the anniversary of his first cigarette at Camp McCoy, he would buy a pack of Camels, smoke one in silence, and bury the rest. When he died in 2003, his family found a letter in his desk. It read, "They told us American cigarettes would steal our souls,
but they gave me back my humanity. For that I will always be grateful and always ashamed." His students called him a kind man. His children called him a quiet man. But in his heart he remained a soldier who had faced the ultimate test, not of courage, but of trust. And in the end, he chose to believe, not in propaganda, but in people. In the spring of 2010, a groundskeeper at a small school in Kyoto was digging a new flower bed when his shovel struck something hard. Not a rock, not a root, but a rusted metal box, wrapped in oilcloth, buried 3 feet underground. Inside were 47 unopened packs of American cigarettes, Lucky Strikes, Camels, Chesterfields, each carefully preserved in wax paper, their labels faded but legible. Tucked between them was a notebook, its pages brittle with age, filled with the same neat script that had once graced the blackboards of this very school. It belonged to Hiroshi Tanaka. For decades, Tanaka had taught history to generations of Japanese students, never once mentioning his time as a POW in Wisconsin. But in this private ledger, he had recorded every cigarette he had ever accepted from an American. From that first trembling moment at Camp McCoy in 1944 to the final pack he buried in 1999, a year before his death. Each entry was dated, annotated, and accompanied by a single line of reflection. March 12, 1944. Camp McCoy. First Camel. Hands shook. Did not taste like poison. Tasted like rain. July 3, 1945. Camp Lordsburg. Shared with Sergeant Delaney. No words, just smoke. Felt like peace. November 11, 1945. On ship home. Last American cigarette. Smoked it watching the Pacific. Wondered if I betrayed Japan or saved myself. The final entry, dated October 28, 1999, read, "Buried the last pack today. My hands no longer shake, but my heart still does. Not from fear, from gratitude and shame. They told us American kindness was poison, but it was the antidote to the lie we were forced to live. I am not a hero. I am a man who chose to live, and that is enough." When the school donated the box to the Hiroshima Peace Memorial Museum, curators were stunned. Here was not just a relic of war, but a testament to the quiet courage it takes to accept mercy and the lifelong burden of doing so. Because for men like Tanaka, the real war didn't end in 1945. It ended the moment they realized the enemy was human. And that truth, more than any battlefield, was the hardest to survive. The discovery of Tanaka's cigarettes sparked a quiet reckoning in Japan. For decades, the official narrative of the Pacific War had focused on sacrifice, honor, and victimhood. Hiroshima, Nagasaki, the Tokyo firebombing. But the story of the POWs, the men who surrendered, who lived, who accepted American cigarettes, had been erased. They were the invisible veterans, the unspoken shame, the living contradiction to the myth of unwavering loyalty. Now, their story could no longer be ignored. Historians began interviewing the few surviving Japanese POWs. What they found was not treason, but trauma of a different kind. The trauma of having survived when you were taught that survival was betrayal. One former prisoner, Kenji Mori, no relation to the man who died at Camp Ruston, described it this way. "In Japan, we were told the Americans would torture us, starve us, kill us. But they gave us food, clean beds, cigarettes. And that was worse. Because it meant everything we'd been taught was a lie. And if the war was a lie, then what was my suffering for?" This is the core of what modern psychologists call benevolence trauma, a form of moral injury that occurs not from cruelty, but from unexpected kindness in a context where cruelty was expected. The brain, primed for threat, interprets generosity as deception. Trust becomes terror, and relief becomes guilt. Dr. Akira Sato, a psychiatrist at Kyoto University, has spent 20 years studying this phenomenon among Japanese veterans. In his 2015 paper, The Poison of Mercy, Benevolence Trauma in Pacific War POWs, he wrote, "These men were not broken by captivity. They were broken by the realization that their captors were not monsters. And in that realization, their entire moral framework collapsed. The cigarette was not the weapon. The truth was." His work has led to a new approach in Japan's veteran care system, not just treating PTSD, but helping men reconcile with the act of having accepted kindness. One therapy session involves veterans lighting an American cigarette, not to smoke, but to hold, to feel its weight, to remember the moment they chose life over myth. And for many, that simple act is the first step towards peace.
But the legacy of the cigarette fear extends far beyond Japan. In the deserts of Iraq, in the mountains of Afghanistan, in detention centers across the globe, the same dynamic plays out again and again. Because the belief that kindness is a weapon is not unique to Imperial Japan. It is a universal response to total war. In 2012, a U.S. Army psychologist named Dr. Elena Martinez was assigned to a forward operating base in Kandahar. Her mission? To build rapport with local detainees suspected of Taliban ties. Standard protocol involved offering tea, food, and conversation, but the men refused. Not out of defiance, but because, as one finally whispered through an interpreter, "In our villages, they say Americans poison the tea to steal your soul." Martinez recognized the pattern immediately. She had studied the Japanese POW cases in graduate school, so she did something radical. She brought her own teacup, poured from the same pot, drank first. Then she offered it again. This time, the man accepted. Not because he trusted her, but because she had made herself vulnerable. Over the next 6 months, that small ritual, shared tea, shared risk, broke down walls that interrogation never could. The man eventually provided critical intelligence that saved dozens of lives. When Martinez published her findings in the Journal of Military Psychology, she titled it "The Cigarette Protocol: Rebuilding Trust Through Shared Vulnerability." Her conclusion was simple. You cannot prove you are not a monster by saying so. You prove it by showing your humanity. And sometimes that starts with a cigarette or a cup of tea. Today, her protocol is taught at the Defense Intelligence Agency and the FBI's Hostage Negotiation Unit. Because the legacy of Camp McCoy is timeless. Trust is not given, it is demonstrated. Back in the United States, the story of the poisoned cigarette fear has found a new home, not in history books, but in the healing of American veterans. At the VA Medical Center in San Diego, a unique program called Shared Smoke helps combat veterans process their own moral injuries. Many returned from war haunted not by what they did, but by what they saw, and by the moments they showed mercy to an enemy who, by all logic, didn't deserve it. In one session, a Marine who served in Fallujah described giving water to a wounded insurgent. He looked at me like I was the enemy, but I couldn't let him die. Now I wonder, did I do the right thing, or did I betray my brothers? The therapist's response was not analysis,
It was ritual. She handed him a pack of American Spirit, unfiltered, strong, real. She said, "Smoke one, not for him, for you, to remember that you chose humanity, and that is never betrayal." The program does not promise absolution. It promises witness, and in that witnessing, healing begins. Because the deepest wound of war is not the act of killing. It is the fear that choosing compassion makes you weak. And the cigarette, simple, mundane, human, becomes a symbol that it does not. But the most profound truth of this story is not about war. It is about what we teach our children. In Imperial Japan, boys were taught that the world was divided into pure and corrupt, loyal and traitorous, human and monster. There was no gray, no nuance, no room for mercy. And when those boys grew up and faced an enemy who offered them a cigarette, they saw not a man, but a test, a trap, a poison. We like to think we are different. But how often do we teach our own children to see the world in binaries? Us versus them, good versus evil, winners versus losers. And when life presents us with a moment of unexpected kindness from an enemy, a rival, a stranger, a former foe, how often do we hesitate? How often do we wonder, what do they want from me? The Japanese soldiers were not weak for fearing the cigarette. They were human, and their fear was not irrational. It was the natural response to a world that had taught them that trust is dangerous. The true courage was not in refusing the cigarette. It was in accepting it, knowing it might break you, and doing it anyway.
Today, the site of Camp Lordsburg in New Mexico is a quiet field of sagebrush and mesquite. There is no marker, no memorial, no trace of the barracks where Hiroshi Tanaka first smoked with Sergeant Delaney under the stars. But in 2018, Delaney's grandson, a history teacher in Des Moines, traveled to Kyoto to visit Tanaka's grave. He brought with him a single pack of Camels, just like the ones his grandfather had shared. He didn't smoke it. He placed it on the tombstone. And as he stood there, an elderly man approached, Tanaka's son. They did not speak the same language, but the son understood. He bowed, and in that bow, two families, once enemies, acknowledged a truth that transcends war. Mercy is not weakness. It is the hardest kind of strength. There is one final artifact from this story. In the National Archives in College Park, Maryland, in a box labeled RG226OSS Smoke 1944, sits a single prototype cigarette from the smoke signal program. It was never used, never deployed. Just a relic of a war that considered even kindness a weapon. Next to it, in a separate folder, is a letter from Sergeant Frank Delaney dated May 8, 1945, VE Day. It reads, "They told us to break them, but I think we healed each other. Today, Hiroshi smoked a Camel and laughed at my terrible Japanese. I think that's how wars really end, not with surrender, but with a shared smoke and the courage to be human." The letter is yellowed with age, but the truth it holds is timeless. Because the real horror of this story is not that Japanese soldiers thought American cigarettes were poisoned. It is that in a world built on lies, the truth feels like poison. And the real heroism is not in dying for a cause, it is in living for one, even when it means admitting you were wrong. Even when it means accepting a cigarette from the enemy. Even when it means choosing to believe that kindness is not a trap, but a gift. And the most terrifying gift of all
is the one that asks you to see yourself as you truly are. Not a monster, not a hero, but a human being. And that is enough.